But before we get into all that, allow me to take a moment for some real talk. You're most likely here at the Stronghold because you've taken notice of the value-oriented content that I make. It may seem out of this world, but the truth is mid-range channels like this only make it thanks to viewer support. The reality is YouTube simply doesn't do enough ad share profit sharing to cover even basic cost of operations for a channel like mine. I've never envisioned the Stronghold as a way to make money, but having it reach a level of self-sufficiency would be really nice. And hey, I'm all about value, and that effort doesn't fall short in my Patreon. For as little as a $1 a month pledge, you get access to additional content, analysis, and tools, as well as a shout out in most every YouTube video I produce. The list and draft analysis alone could easily add $1 or more to your collection every month. Best of all, your support goes right back into the channel and the expanding content I produce. There's a link to my Patreon page in the description below, so I'd appreciate it if you take a moment and check it out. Every bit of support, no matter how small, makes a huge difference to our future. Thanks so much for your time and consideration. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Alright, so yeah, standard is big, but before we can really talk about how that impacts us, particularly as budget players, we need to kind of wrap our heads around the numbers. So how big is standard? Well, that's not so hard to find out. We can actually pull the data on set size for all the sets currently in standard, and when you do so, you get a number just over 3,700 cards. Now, these numbers don't appear to include things like basic lands, but to be honest, I made no effort to back out things like redundant reprints within standard sets. Furthermore, we need to keep in mind that we just went through a standard rotation and had 4 sets leave standard. And if nothing changes with the schedule, we won't go through another standard rotation until roughly January of 2027. That's a full 15 months, give or take, from now. So by the time we reach that last set of 2026, we're going to be looking at almost 6,000 cards in standard. And if the theories are correct and we're looking at a surprise 7th set for the 2026 calendar year, of course, that's going to be over 6,000 cards in standard. And let me tell you, that's absolutely huge. When I was coming up as a player and playing on a more competitive edge, standard was less than 2,000 cards at its largest. And of course, at any given time, it was significantly less than that, depending upon where you were in the annual cycle. All right, so now that we have defined the standard card pool, we have a somewhat tougher job of trying to wrap our heads around what is involved in the standard meta. And to do that, well, the meta is constantly shifting and changing, despite what certain Vivi cards might want you to think. It's always in flux, so we're going to do a statistically bad thing and make some assumptions and generalizations here. Let's start by assuming that a happy, healthy standard meta consists of 10 decks at any given time that are actually pretty relevant. Now, further, let's say we don't care about the land bases and those, and let's limit our discussion to the 36 roughly non-land slots in each of those decks. Beyond that, let's further assume that those decks only play full play sets of 4. So those 36 cards divided by the 4 gives us 9 relevant cards for each deck. And just to make the math a little easier, let's assume there is absolutely no overlap between any of these decks, that they're all entirely independent builds. That's 10 decks at 9 cards per deck, or 90 relevant cards in the standard meta, not including things like lands. So if we take these numbers and just do some really simple math, that's 90 meta-relevant cards out of a pool of a little over 3,700 cards currently. That means each card in Standard has a roughly 2.4% chance of becoming meta-relevant, just based on the numbers. Now, granted, if we look at best of 3 Standard, where sideboard suddenly becomes relevant, we probably need to add something like another 30 cards, and since we're looking at this from a budget perspective, and budget players aren't always playing the most meta-relevant cards, we probably need to add something like another 50% or so. So we might be looking at as much as 180 total cards to really get a better framing of what this looks like. But that's still a very small percentage of what's out there. And this is what has changed Standard so dramatically. We used to be able to get by as budget players by just collecting the majority of the cards and having them in our collection. Now it's more about making sure we have the right cards moving forward and spending as little resources as we can for the vast majority of irrelevant cards that are introduced. As we begin to discuss individual decks, I want to start by taking a seasonal approach, starting with the Universes Beyond Final Fantasy set. The first budget deck that was really on our radar there was the Garnet Saga deck, and while it shows a lot of promise, frankly, I think it's a little ahead of its time. Garnet, obviously being a 2-drop, is a great place in the curve to be getting started, but this deck ultimately was way too dependent on its 3-drop slot, which is where most of the budget-relevant sagas were going to want to live. Therefore, curving into 4 or 5 mana beyond that really led to a lot of inefficiencies that kept the deck from converting. Basically, if your opponent had any sort of removal, either for Garnet or the sagas, it just really did not gel the way we wanted it to. At a future point, if we get some new sagas, maybe at different relevant mana points and things like that, this deck could still be doing something. But for the moment, I think this is probably best served on your back burner for development purposes. In a much more successful space was the Black-Red Wizards Pinger deck. This deck does phenomenally well, particularly as a budget deck. You only need a handful of commons and uncommons to build the deck, and then the rest of it is just made up of your standard black-red removal pieces, whether that is damage base, sacrifice base, destroy base, etc. You can also find slots for various griefer cards like hand discard and things like that. And the most painful thing about this deck is it's very close to being one of those destroy all your opponent's creature decks that people want to play, and I'm constantly telling people not to. So this is probably as close to a deck like that as you will ever see me recommend. And last but certainly not least, for the Final Fantasy budget decks is the Green Landfall. Honestly, when this deck was first spoiled and introduced, I really thought it was going to be a Green X deck, with blue and red being the most likely supported colors out there, as those were the landfall archetypes for the limited environment. But green-white was also a possibility for some other reasons, and lo and behold, the best version for budget players is actually mono green. I'm not sure if that's surprising or not, but there it is. And, well, spoilers, this is probably the best budget deck in the standard environment, as well as most other at least rotational formats, being Alchemy and Standard Brawl. And it does pretty darn well in Brawl as well. So if you're not building this deck, if you haven't done so already, there's no time like the present, kids. Moving on, Edge of Eternities is a set which has, beyond the Shocklands, had no measurable impact on Standard. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not some budget deck potential here. For instance, Blink is a deck that is almost there. Particularly something like a blue-white Blink. And if you spend some resources to get these cards into your collection, don't feel bad, because I think this archetype is going to become much more relevant, at least for budget players, with the introduction of Avatar: The Last Airbender, specifically the Airbend mechanic, which essentially blinks cards and allows you to replay them from exile on later turns. Or even that turn, for that matter. I momentarily forgot how it worked. Similarly, I spent the Edge of Eternity season testing multiple, be it blue-white artifact decks, or my personal favorite, the mono blue surprise attack artifact deck built around Synthesizer Lab Ship. The biggest hurdle that this deck currently has is getting the creatures versus non-creature artifacts balance quite right. Because of course we need creatures in order to station the lab ship itself, and then we need the non-creature artifacts to allow us to surprise generate attackers. And that has been more elusive than I expected it to be. Also in this is another card that will be coming down the Omen pass for us, known as Air 9, a viral node for Arena. This gives you both a creature that can help station the lab ship, as well as an additional trigger to turn, in this case, a non-equipment artifact into, this time around, a 3/3 artifact creature. This one isn't evasive, but it does untap it, so depending upon the artifact, you might get some additional use out of that as well. I'm looking forward to see if this card makes a measurable difference, and I think as little as one copy might very well do so. But of course, artifacts are something that get printed all the time, and this card has 2.5 years left in Standard as far as the lab ship, so it's very possible that we are going to figure this deck out at some point. Before we move on to the tier list, there is one more season that I want to touch on, and that's through the Omen Pass, or Omen Pass 1, aka don't call it Spider-Man on Arena. First off, I think heroes and villains here is not going to make it, at least as a budget playable deck. These tribal types are just too new, it's too internally parasitic to really make a good budget deck. Don't get me wrong, someone is bound to make a deck out on this that might even be meta relevant, but the likelihood that it is also budget friendly is just not all that likely. And to be frank, I don't even think the tribal-friendly aspects that we're expecting with Lorwyn is going to be enough to save this. We are going to need to see 2, perhaps 3 total sets heavily featuring heroes and villains before this really needs to be on a budget player's radar. Of course, the nice thing about the Arena is that we can always craft these cards later when and if they become relevant. On the other hand, nearly 1 out of 5 cards in Omen Paths is a spider in some way or another, and Spider Tribal, particularly in green, looks like it has, if you'll excuse the pun, real legs. With 10 cards existing as a spider creature type in Standard, all of which fit into green, I think this has some real potential, particularly with Lorwyn tribal support inbound. The second potential budget deck on my early radar for Omen Paths 1 is Mayhem. This is another Rakdos build here with a lot of potential. And in fact, I think there's cards here that are going to make it, even if the Mayhem deck itself does not. I remember when Madness got added to Arena, I said that something like Madness was going to be coming back to Standard sooner or later. And, well, here we are. The biggest potential hindrance for this deck is the pre-existing of several good Rakdos decks. The Rakdos Lizards, for one. We also have the previously mentioned in this video black-red Wizard Pinger deck, and of course we also have a black splashing red other color versions of a Reanimator deck. Will this be good enough to be the preferred Rakdos deck? We'll have to wait and see. When I'm doing evaluations, I like to use what I lovingly refer to as the Eastwood rating system, breaking your choices down into 3 easy categories: the good, the bad, and the ugly. In order for a choice to get a rating of good, it's got to be above the moving average of all of the available choices. The bad, however, is actually still generally a playable option, so to speak, being within 1 standard deviation mathematically of having been a good choice. The ugly, however, is everything else that is left. It's not good. It's not even bad. These are the ugly choices that generally aren't even worth our time. So then the question remains, where does that leave the tier list this season? And before I go any further, special thanks to Lord Vader for taking some time out of his intergalactic ruling to help us do the tier list this week. We're going to start with the ugly decks, and there's only 3 that I think are worth really being on the radar, but maybe not developing at the moment. Most of these we have talked about in this video, specifically the white-green sagas and the mono-blue artifacts. Although, if you saw this week's midweek magic, mono-blue artifacts is looking better. So maybe throw some eyeballs on that if you haven't seen it already. If it happens to align with your collection, it might be a good place to be. On the opposite end of the spectrum, one place you definitely don't want to be is trying to develop your blue-red Izzet Foundation starter deck. That is just not worth doing, really, at any point in time so far since it's been released. So be sure to avoid that one. So now let's flip the script and take a look at some good stuff. When we take a look at the good decks, we end up with a nice tight list of fairly unique ideas here. Of course, first and foremost is Mono Green Landfall. It is the best budget deck available, not only in Standard, but across multiple formats. Once you get done watching this video, if you haven't done so already, you should immediately start building this deck, whether that is putting together a list from cards that are already in your pool, or to start farming the Final Fantasy jump-in event and grab those cards from primarily the mono green deck. Beyond that, a tribal deck rooted in Foundations is probably going to want to be your second priority. That being either a mono-white Cats or Life Gain deck. There's a lot of potential overlap there, so depending upon which way the wind is blowing in your collection is going to determine which is the right answer. And alternatively, a mono red Goblins is a very viable build still and weighs very heavily not only on cards from Foundations, but from your starter collection. However, I would not prioritize trying to build both of those decks. If you are still relatively new, developing the Orzhov or white-black Vampire Life Gain deck from your Foundation starters might be the most appropriate place to start for that second deck. and then maybe allow it to develop into that mono white life gain. But of course, that is going to depend very heavily on your experience and collection here on the arena. When we opt to look at the tier 2 or bad but still playable decks, we find a lot. In fact, the tier list will actually have about twice as many decks as what you're seeing on screen, but these are the ones that are slightly above the moving average. So I'd focus on things like the Rabbits Tokens decks, the blue-white flyers, various brawl decks like Alindra and Tifa, the mostly black zombie deck, or zombify deck, I guess I should say, that allows you to cheat in various rares and mythics that maybe have wandered into your collection and not found a home. Of course, we've got the white-black Bat Life deck, as well as mono-green elves, which is really only tier 2 at the moment because of the dominance of mono-green landfall. And of course, this list would not be complete without the white-green +1 counters deck, heavily influenced from your starter, as well as multiple draft archetypes over the last year or so. Again, there are more of these type decks that are slightly below the moving average available in the tier list file that you can find through the link in the description. I promise it's there. But I would start with one of these if you're looking for ways beyond the very best decks to start growing your arsenal. So there it is, guys. Those are my thoughts on the very best budget decks for standard grinding and beyond. Moving forward, I probably will not be doing this topic every single season. The fluctuation with people's feelings about Universes Beyond and various sets makes it somewhat impractical to try and tackle a video this long each and every season. Instead, I'm probably going to be doing it every second or third season, and including that seasonal approach, seasonal perspective there at the midpoint of the video. Let me know what you guys think about that. Get down in the comments and let me know. But of course, rest assured, the tier list available through that link, again, that I promise you is in the description, will always have my current thoughts and updates on that, even if it's been a while since I've done a full video. And before we go, I really want to take a moment to thank my patrons for their months of continuous and reliable support here at the Stronghold. It's this kind of support that really gives me the confidence to make investments in the Stronghold, despite the fact that I'm investing money out of pocket month after month. But thank you guys. This means so much and allows me to do so much for the community. And of course, I have some suggestions for some additional content right here on the Stronghold.